really curious as to if you're like me, like most Canadians, you do a lot of your banking and financial transactions online, and how you're finding things in that regard. Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Ontario, Canada. Listen to Canadian Intelligence, eh? Conversations with practitioners about all things national security. The world's a very different place from when I started working. I started my first job at 13 years old as a sort of a handyman for a set of lawyers, and I got paid $1.92 an hour in cash every 2 weeks. A lot of money back then, by the way. Fast forward, 50 years later, and the world is a very different place. As I mentioned in my introduction, everything is online these days. You do your banking online, you pay your bills online, you e-transfer people online. People that buy my book have been sending me e-transfers since January. And yet it strikes me as this is a potentially very dangerous world in terms of using the internet and social media to transfer money. It's come as a surprise to no one that some of the more nefarious actors in the world, including criminals and terrorist organizations, have caught on to this and are taking advantage of it. I thought then that I would bring into the conversation somebody who knows a lot more about money laundering and terrorist financing than I do. So I'm very pleased to welcome Archie Alafriz. He's a retired member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, who served most of his career in national security. He is a threat finance specialist. He's published. He's now a senior fellow at the Global Peace Institute. He's also affiliated with an organization called Iosi Global. He knows a lot more about this stuff than I do, and he's going to walk us through it. So, Archie, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hello, Phil. Well, thanks for inviting me to this podcast. It certainly is a very interesting topic with a lot of global applications today.
You've used the term threat finance in some of your writing, and I'm curious if you could walk my listeners through what do you mean by threat finance?
That's a very good question, Phil. Like thought about that myself and was trying to declutter it in my head, but I'll try my best to explain it. Basically, it's industry speak today, describing adversarial financing. When we use the word adversarial, it seems not to be a Canadian term, but more of our friends down south.
Mm-hmm.
But more widely, I would include in this category illicit or ill-gotten wealth, which are derivatives of proceeds of crime. And I think that's where the basis of what we believe to be, threat finance. But the definition goes on because threat finance could represent the strategic placement of funds by political adversaries, for example. Um, while some threat finances are not strictly illegal, they could or may represent significant concern to a country's economy or even their national sovereignty. Because quite obviously, if you can't control your economy, then that puts your sovereignty into doubt.
Going back to the sort of career that you had with the RCMP, then we know that money is moved around in the blink of an eye. I don't know what the figures are. You probably know better than I do, but I'm sure it's at billions or trillions of dollars are moved around every day. I see these reports about stock markets, for example, where computer programs are trading stocks that are faster than the human can actually react to. From your perspective, Archie, former the RCMP, how hard is it to identify the nature and scale of this problem? And more importantly, how do you counteract it?
Well, um, I would say that tracking these nefarious funds are between very difficult and extremely difficult.
Mhm.
Because the reality of it is that like the global structure is such a way that um, we're using antiquated tools
Mhm.
to deal with a problem. So let me walk you through this, a little bit. The current global compliance regime is based on what we call the 40 plus 9 recommendations, and I'm talking about the financial industry as opposed to law enforcement.
Mhm.
So this 40 plus 9 recommendations were handed down by what we call the Financial Action Task Force, and that's the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog. It came into being in 1989, but it took a decade from its initial inception as a G7 initiative 10 years earlier in 1979.
Wow.
This really meant to be an annual economic summit, or thereabouts. So the FATF, through its work by 1989, presented its first 40 recommendations to address money laundering. Um, and it wasn't after the attack of 911 that they added the further 9 recommendations, which specifically addressed the financing of terrorism
Hmm.
almost exclusively. So, this is what the industry calls the 40 plus 9.
Right.
Now, in the AML world, or the anti money laundering world, this particular regime was further reinforced by what's called the Wolfsburg AML principles, anti money laundering principles, which were created in 2000 as a result of 13 global banks getting together at Castle Wolfsburg in Switzerland and creating a framework, a platform, and a set of guidelines to manage financial risk in private banking. So you can tell that this is all, um, a process driven system.
Hmm.
And how effective is it? Well, I mean, it has its positive metrics, but it's easily defeated by infrastructures that are created to defeat it.
Hmm.
So now what happens is we have, and on top of that, we're looking at this 40 plus 9, and specifically the plus 9, which I lived on for 14 years of my career in anti-terrorist financing. And the issue with this plus 9 and the whole concept of anti-terrorist financing in terms of the global regime was that it was simply piggybacked on anti-money laundering infrastructure or architecture.
Okay. Okay.
So, and you and I know that these are two very, very different things.
Exactly.
And, we're still, industry wise, we're still fighting that battle, if you can believe it, where over the last 20 years or so, these certification programs have delved more inwardly into the processes, as opposed to people really understanding, um, the concept of threat finance and where it's going in the future.
Yeah.
So, sorry,
So,
go ahead.
no, go ahead, please. Continue.
So the end result of that is, I don't know how else to describe it, but look, you were there in the industry the same time I was when you
Hmm.
were working for the service.
Hmm.
And if we were to rely on figures from Stuart Bell in 2006, that the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam were, required $300 million to fight their war against the Sri
Hmm.
Lankan government,
Hmm.
and most of that was passing through right underneath my very nose.
Wow. Boy, that sure I think puts a point on it, Archie. Without, dismissing or undermining what the work that you did, the RCMP and your colleagues, would you say that in, late 2021, that when it comes to this threat financing, be it terrorist financing or money laundering or whatever, nefarious actors raising and sending funds, are we constantly in a game of catch up? And if we were to call a spade, would we pretty well acknowledge that the bad guys really are they really have a step up on us, and that they are more or less acting freely in this environment, or am I being too cruel here?
Actually, if you just took the question mark out of what you said, Phil, you basically said, said it all. Now let's go and take a look at what currently is occurring, like here in 2021 in British Columbia, where I reside, and we're looking at the Cullen Commission and its investigation into money laundering in in the casinos, real estate, luxury vehicles. And
Right.
I was part of that, the earlier, the precursor investigation into luxury vehicles and real estate.
Right.
And look at what's coming out of the media today from the Cullen Commission. They're saying that the police today are totally incapable
Hmm.
of conducting these types of investigations anymore. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and it's not just the police's fault. I mean, from 2013, um, because because of the politics of the day, the RCMP lost its significant amount of funding at the federal and contract levels, which
Hmm.
forced all the specialized sections to collapse into more generalized sections. And
Right,
of
right.
course, we lost all the expertise. That's one, and there are many more reasons that just combine to create this type of effect today.
Would it be fair to say as well, Archie, that when it comes to things like terrorist financing and money laundering, um, pardon me, no one gets hurt. Bombs don't go off, people don't get killed. And so, from the public perspective, we kind of know what's happening, but it's in the background. It'll probably happen anyway. And that's what I'm getting at. Do you sense that from a prioritization perspective, whether it's the RCMP or other agencies that are looking at bad guys doing bad things in general, that this is seen as much like well, we'll get to it when we get to it, but the first things first. We don't want anybody to get killed. We don't want bombs going off. We don't want planes flying into buildings. Has it been sort of relegated to a second tier in terms of operational priorities?
For the most part, it has, but evidenced by the fact that we really technically don't have an anti-terrorist financial investigation unit anywhere in Canada anymore, and neither does the RCMP have the expertise inboard to boot it up. You're looking at how important is the disruption of terrorist finance. Well, let's walk back to terrorist event pre-incident indicators, and we modeled this around the time just after 9/11,
Mm-hmm.
looking at the behavior of terrorist organizations. So walking through the steps, we have an ideology, the motivation and the intentions, and then the next step after that would be the recruiting
Right,
of the people with like-minded ideas, and then
mm-hmm.
you have the fundraising,
Right,
because after the fundraising comes in all the operational stuff, which is the forged identification. We've seen that in investigations, the reconnaissance of targets, target selection, training, establishment of safe houses, acquisition of ammunition and other materials or bomb making materials, pre-positioning or the logistics of materials and actors into the specific locations, uh, the final reconnaissance, and the deployment, and ultimately the action of the offense. And when you look
right.
at where fundraising and financing is very low in the totem pole.
Mm-hmm.
So think of a startup incubator software company that had great ideas but could never raise the amount or the seed financing to get it out into the marketplace. This is
Mm-hmm.
how important financing is to a terrorist organization. But you and I know today that your classic sort of terrorism or terrorist group um, are no longer created this way,
Right,
right? And
right.
they've evolved. So, notwithstanding, I mean, when we go back to threat financing, and and your question, well, how difficult is it really to track threat finances? Well, you and I know that some of the biggest conductors of this type of activity are governments and neo governments,
Yeah,
or agencies that support them, which have uh, incredibly large infrastructure,
yeah.
um, and that easily cut through or walk through these compliance people that are still very process driven and
Mm-hmm.
internally focused.
Mm-hmm. I,
Um, yeah.
I'm so glad you raised this point about financing, because I was going to push back on it a little bit. In terms of, you're right. The Tamil Tigers, of course, the Liberation Timers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE, were very big in Canada in the 80s and 90s. Stuart Bell wrote a lot about this in his first book, Cold Terror. Amongst the large Tamil diaspora community here in Canada, a lot of them were asked, or let's face it, pressured, threatened to support the LTT actions back in Sri Lanka. And that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end, you get cases that you and I probably both worked on, things people like the Toronto 18 and other so-called lone actor terrorists these days, where, let's face it, Archie, you don't have to be a millionaire to walk into a train station with a knife. Or even the Toronto 18. I mean, they were selling, trying to raise money and get fertilizer and stuff. But this was not a multi-million dollar plot. Is that making things complicated where you've got law enforcement agencies who are involved in this, and when push comes to shove, I could, as a former friend of mine who worked in the Toronto region of CSIS said, he could build a bomb with what he's got in his wallet, which was like $30, a really inexpensive bomb. So how does the fact that terrorism is now being done on the cheap, so-called cheap? We had a recent attack in New Zealand, in Auckland, by a guy with a knife who wanted to join ISIS. So basically, it's cost free. There's no financing that. How does that complicate things these days, you think?
And you're absolutely right with respect to the cost of terrorist acts. I mean, look at it. 2005, or sorry, yeah, 2000. I believe it's 2005, if I remember correctly. London bus bombing,
Yep.
and that was financed by a defaulted student loan,
Wow.
right? Of less than of about 8,000 British sterling,
So
and
12,000 Canadian or so, yeah.
not a lot of money. Well, yeah, and probably less so then,
Yeah.
because of the conversion rate.
Yeah.
When we look at the Madrid train bombing of the previous year, that was a hand-to-hand exchange of narcotics to explosives,
Yes, that's
and
right.
you're looking, and gee, what part of our architecture uh, will detect that?
Yeah.
And the answer is no.
Yeah.
When we look at the Bali bombing in 2000, I believe it was 2002.
2002. Yep.
Yeah,
2002. Yep.
2002. That was a $30,000. That Jakarta Marriott was $30,000, that in terms of estimation.
Yeah.
Bali nightclub bombing, 20,000. That was in 2002. And the 1998 Africa embassy bombings was estimated to be just around 10,000 US dollars.
This is almost pocket change in some ways then.
Yeah, it is. Mumbai, was a bigger one at 85,000, but then that was 2008. But the 2012 Boston Marathon only cost 2,000.
Yeah.
The Westgate Mall in Nairobi in 2013 was 5,000. So yeah, there is a limitation. I think when we deal with threat finances at the level that we do, is we want to address the organizational level of these activities, which provides the capacity for them um, to spread more widely their ideology. So
Hmm.
it's not the end all and be all of defenses by all means. It is just a small component, but it's something, notwithstanding, that we need to really master.
Would it be fair to say, Archie, given that, like in a country like Canada, for example, let's face it, we don't see a lot of terrorism. I mean, I wrote my most recent book. We've only had, maybe a couple dozen attacks in 154 years of history. We're not Somalia, we're not Afghanistan, where terrorist attacks are taking place all the time. And a lot of Western countries, I think, are in very similar boats to this. Would it be fair to say that from a threat financing perspective, from a law enforcement angle, that the prioritization should be more things like organized crime and those types of groups that are trying to use the financial system to their gain rather than terrorists?
That's a very good question, Phil, because again, you and I, going back a little bit over a decade ago, were examining convergence theory. We're talking
Yes.
about the convergence of transnational crime and terrorism. And now we see state actors of terrorism engaged in transnational activities in Latin America.
Yes. Yes.
Very well published, and something that we should have and could have predicted. Um, and why it was so important to notate that then and address today is because we feel the influence of those organizations, and let's name them. It's Hezbollah
Yep.
and the IRGC Quds Force,
Yes.
uh,
Absolutely.
present here in Canada. It's very hard to read the methodology of Hezbollah, because there's a lot of it that's underground. But the Quds Force, or the QF, I estimated up to about 10 years ago, we're moving $1 billion across Canada in what I call a cloud economy.
$1 billion.
$1 billion.
And that was a long time ago.
Uh, that was my 10-year estimate.
Wow.
From an estimate from 10 years ago. I haven't been able to, to go back because I've not had access to that financial intelligence, or have not requested that type of financial intelligence from Egmont or FinTrack.
So I hate to ask you this, Archie, but talking to you today and listening to what you have to say, I get the impression that things aren't good and there's no real hope them getting better anytime soon. Am I just being and I'm a glass kind of half full kind of guy. I mean, is this a realistic view on just how bad the situation is and how unprepared and under resourced we are to deal with it?
Um, you know, yes. The short answer to that is
Okay.
yes. And we're almost at the mercy, but that thank God terrorists don't really hate Canada. And I'm
Yeah,
sure you've had this impression
yeah,
over the
yeah,
last number of years. And of course, there's a lot of theatrics in the world that we call generally as terrorism.
yes, yeah,
Between the tradecraft of security agencies, between the the foreign policies of certain countries, and we watched how this that was our job, was to
yeah,
watch these things and pay attention to those things that would really cause us harm.
yeah,
But generally what we have is in the finance world and in the world of like threat geopolitics, it's the wide world.
yeah,
um,
exactly.
and I mean, just look at the whole issue over Afghanistan and
Hmm.
its withdrawal. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to question yourself if you don't know the answer to why the CIA director would be meeting with the Taliban. You know, it
Yes,
that may be vital to your daily life and
exactly.
how you understand the world.
Well, and as I'm sure you would agree, Archie, that the whole Afghanistan shit show, where after 20 years, we're basically handing the keys to the kingdom back to the very people we tried to get out 20, anyhow, let's not go down that pathway. So, Archie, you're now the chairman for IOSI Global Organization for Security Intelligence. What exactly is that organization and what does it do?
Well, the IOSI is, I mean, the acronym stands for the International Organization for Security and Intelligence. And just to go back a little bit in history here, its founders were a group of people that I was assisting on and off over a number of years, because this organization was actually born in Canada.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
but what it is, it's a global nonprofit organization comprised of security and intelligence practitioners. It just so happens that as this network grew, it it invited more of the same type of people that are involved in the same industry, which was security and intelligence globally. Now, you know, I was brought on to chair the board last June. It's an honorary position, but I also found that it had at that time around 25,000 members already,
Hmm.
and follow in and a lot more followers around the world through all various media platforms that it existed. So what was initially a social network for these practitioners, we now want to evolve it into a global marketplace for these very specialized talents. And we're developing business lines along crypto recovery, um, risk management of what I call gray finances, intellectual property, ransomware prevention, things that help the public and educate the public. Ultimately, we just want to be an international conduit for these types of non-governmental investigative services.
Wow, that what a very noble and a great thing to do, Archie. Like you said, people like me, even people that me worked in the business for more than 3 decades, do not have a good understanding of what this is all about. And so, kudos to you and the people that you work with to try to educate people. Now, Archie, in the past 48 hours, you and I have been in touch, sort of parallel to this podcast today, and I got a request from a friend who had lost big time in Bitcoin investments. There was some kind of a scam. This person, I won't obviously name the person or the amount, but it was significant. In your experience, is this something that happens really, really frequently? I mean, this has nothing to do with terrorism, I don't think, anything to do with money laundering or anything, but it simply points to the amount of nefarious activity online when it comes to financing. In your estimation, just how bad is this problem, and how much worse is it going to get?
Well, it's with every bit of advancing technology, it's kind of new territory for enforcement that's already been playing catch up over the last
Right,
half century. In the case of crypto theft, which is what we're talking about, where this is a spoofed investment firm that's been able to um, attract investors, and it's of course socially engineered to keep them investing. And
right.
um, every time you invest, and a month later you can see your return on the investment. It's provided to you online, or in the database that you can access. It's become really sophisticated, as you can imagine. But the issue here is, how can you tell what's real and what's not? Where we're still having those kind of problems, believe it or not, in the general capital markets.
Wow.
The Security Exchange Commission, the SEC in the United States, is all the security commissions here in Canada through the individual provinces are busy looking at these frauds. All the different types of market manipulations, the different types of pump and dumps. Um,
Hmm.
so this particular problem will only increase over time, because we don't seem to have a strategy to grapple it. So let's look at this one for one example that we're talking about, the one that you referred to me.
Hmm.
Fortunately, we're already in touch with a data analytics company with a very good capacity to write algorithms on the spot, and detect um, where these monies could eventually go. To one of the things that I was talking to them about was that on one of their previous files, they were dealing with an exchange that was in Turkey.
Hmm.
And this is where it was the recipient of the cryptocurrency that had been used in a ransomware operation. But when they dialed back through their own analytics, they found that, based on the source IP, that it had victimized or attempted to victimize 68,000 other IP addresses.
Wow.
So this is one operation. And the question that I would want answered is, of the 68,000, how many were actually reported to law enforcement or became?
Exactly. Probably not a heck of a lot, right?
No, no, not a lot. So there remains a very large dark figure, in that aspect of the economy, that uh, we just don't have a strategy for. Now, hopefully, because of some of the um, compliance measures that have been put in place, that if you are a legitimate exchange and you follow um, the conventions, that you would have what they call the KYC and KYT, know your client and
Yeah.
know your transactions. You would have recorded uh, whose uh, whose account this is, and double checked and verified that information to a true person. But that cannot be true in all instances, as you know.
Hmm.
And therein lies the difficulty. So, at the beginning of this podcast, you mentioned that um, we're looking at electronic means of investment, and banking mechanisms, and how secure are those. Um, I would say secure enough, but they're imperfect.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, we can implement the most secure and effective system out there, it's always the human being that fails in that chain.
Archie, my late mother, God rest her soul, grew up during the Depression in Montreal in the 20s and 30s. And I think it had a lasting impression on her. She would always keep money around the house in envelopes. And I think it was because she grew up basically with, no 2 cents to rub together. Knowing what you do, my friend, about terrorist financing and money laundering and nefarious activity online, do you keep a shoebox of cash under your bed? Just curious.
I do not. In our profession, that wasn't, you didn't have a lot of excesses to throw around into shoe boxes. Some who uses cash nowadays? The other day I was sitting at the Metrotown Mall having lunch, and a fellow with a disability left a card that says, if you can assist, could you contribute a few dollars, so on and so forth. And I would have contributed to him, but I don't carry cash anymore. Do you?
Yeah. Well, I still do. I think I have part of my mother and me still. I've always have a 20 in my wallet, but you're absolutely right. I think that the 99% of all transactions we do at the grocery store or the beer store or whatever, you just whip out your debit card and I'm wearing a Fitbit now, and apparently I can use my Fitbit to actually. I'm not going to do that because I'm really conservative, but I think it just goes to show you what you're saying, right? We've made it so easy to buy anything, anywhere, anytime, and so surprise, surprise, the bad guys have queued onto this too and figured, hey, we can make money that way as well.
I mean, there are solutions in the horizon if you really want to think about it. We talk about threat finances, and we look at China. Like China's gone and is going to convert its fiat currency into digital.
Mm-hmm.
That affords them the ability to monitor where
Mm-hmm.
each and every RMB goes to. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that's not a perfect solution,
No, no.
but it gets close.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd want the Chinese government monitoring my transactions if I was a Uyghur or in Hong Kong or a Tibetan kind of thing. But anyhow, listen, Archie, I think we could go on for days talking about these matters. You really provided, I think, a very sobering but a very realistic insight into the nature of this world, what we're doing about it, and the challenges that are still remaining. So, on behalf of my listeners, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Phil. It was a great pleasure. And maybe one of these days, let's have a beer offline.
I'd rather have a beer on the offline world than the online world, my friend. So that was my conversation with Archie Alafriz, former RCMP specialist in money laundering and terrorist financing. What do you think about this whole notion of money moving around and the challenges that law enforcement and security intelligence agencies have in monitoring what terrorists and criminals are doing with it? Love to hear your feedback. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter at borealissaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and Facebook. If you like the content, want to get more, you can subscribe. Go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com. Find a subscription area. You get the free podcast. You get Today in Terrorism. You get quick hits. You get all kinds of things free of charge in your inbox, as well as a link to my latest book, The Peaceful Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present, which is self-published and therefore available only through me. Love to hear what you thought about this, as well as ideas for other podcasts. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.